Hey everyone, so for my final presentation, I'm talking about preserving and revitalizing Alaska Native languages. So there are a number of different native languages in Alaska. Some are still alive and spoken, while others have died or are in the process of quickly dying. According to Leonard and Gilmore, as a result of aggressive U.S. suppression of all of these languages during this century, many of them have only very limited number of speakers remaining. When missionaries, traders, and others came into Alaska, they brought in diseases that killed much of the native population. Native populations in Alaska lost up to 2/3 of their numbers during the epidemic of the early 1900s. Missionaries started schools in the Alaska Native rural communities, where the teachers insisted on only teaching using English, and the children were punished if caught using their native languages or other cultural practices. The parents were also encouraged not to use native languages at home with their children, but instead to only speak English. With all these factors, it would make sense that there are now only a few speakers or none at all of the different Alaska Native languages. A real-life example of the small numbers of native speakers left would be with the Tanana and Ahtna languages. The severity of the 1918 flu epidemic and the Susitna villages and the dispersal of the Upper Inlet people along the Alaska Railroad in the 1920s have greatly disrupted Upper Inlet Tanana life. Today there are about 50 speakers of Upper Inlet Tanana language. The Ahtna language, close in proximity to the Upper Inlet Tanana, have about 40 speakers left. Interestingly, due to these villages being relatively close to one another, Upper Inlet Tanana shares a considerable number of linguistic traits with the Ahtna language. So you can see there's Upper Tanana and the Ahtna here. The fact that they are similar provides some hope in that even if one language dies, the other can still be comparable and useful to researchers. However, that is not always the case, and this example of two dying native languages is, unfortunately, a reality for many Alaska Native languages. Dying Alaska Native languages, such as Tanana and Ahtna, shows the importance and urgency of preserving and revitalizing these languages before they no longer exist. These languages help shape the many cultures present here in Alaska. To some people, the diminishing of Alaska Native languages is just a fact of life, a survival of the fittest. But to others, especially the indigenous people of Alaska, the imminent loss is much more personal, for with the language goes the intricacy of culture, worldview, and the indigenous identity that was best expressed through that language. Despite the desire to preserve and revitalize Alaska Native languages, there are some challenges that go along with it. For example, some indigenous people feel that progress, in the modern sense, requires giving up some old ways, including language, and that efforts to save a dying language are not the best use of time when there are so many issues at stake that seem more pressing. Ultimately, the decision to preserve and revitalize a dying language comes down to the speakers of that language, not by linguists or anthropologists. Without the participation from the speakers themselves, attempts to preserve and revitalize languages will ultimately fail. Any attempts will fail because without the input of the native speakers themselves, preserving and revitalizing the language has no purpose if the people who would use that language the most do not want to use it. The first step in preserving and revitalizing a language is to get community members that have continued to speak in a language and also have the desire to save their language. The next step in preserving and revitalizing the languages is to have those same community members determine what goals and procedures will be most effective in their community. One strategy that has been effective in keeping Alaska Native languages alive has been the use of storytelling. This is a strategy that has been passed down from generation to generation throughout all Alaska Native cultures. Storytelling served as a primary way to teach Alaska Native children about how to treat one another in nature. Storytelling continues to be valued as a means to help children understand who they are and to make sense of their surroundings while instilling a sense of pride in their cultural heritage. Another positive aspect of storytelling is that stories are often parallel with real-life experiences that are shared by community members. This allows children to not only learn about subsistence living, but also allows them to hear these stories and lessons from community members in their native language. This is one way that Alaska Natives have been able to pass down and keep their native languages alive all these years. A recent example of the advantage of storytelling was in a Yupik village in June of 2000. A group of young and elder Yupik people gathered together for what they soon began calling Culture Camp. For 10 days, young Yupik kids worked with, learned from, and listened to Yupik elders in a village called Kumayat. This was especially important to the elders, for they were displaying their unique view of the world in all they said and did. The elders were giving the youngsters information on their culture, but also the tools to reproduce it. The children might have come into the camp wearing modern clothing and shoes and riding on four-wheelers, but they left and went home with their metaphorical pockets full of wisdom and culture. Not only was what they were learning unique to their culture, but so was the method in which they learned it. The elders only talked in Yupik to the children. While the children were learning and practicing subsistent living, they were also learning and practicing their native Yupik language. However, something to point out is that a translator was still needed for the handful of kids who did not know Yupik. Needing translators for some of the children who did not know Yupik shows how fewer and fewer people in each generation know their native language. Some of this could be a choice of the Alaska Native people, but it could also be from the influence of Western culture and way of learning. One idea of a way to preserve and revitalize Alaska Native languages in Alaska has been to correct what has been a big reason for the dying languages in the first place. As mentioned earlier, some of the first schools in Alaska were strict about not letting the children speak their native language while in school, and parents were encouraged to not speak it at home. There have been attempts to incorporate the native languages into the school curriculums throughout Alaska. Native communities have sought to revitalize their historic customs, and part of that includes reintroducing traditional teaching and learning practices back into education systems. Reintegration of cultural values and practices into educational systems is associated with an increased sense of positive social identity, improved academic performance, and greater overall well-being for Alaska Native students. This concept of bringing back Alaska Native way of thinking and learning into the various Alaska Native schools throughout the state could be a step in the right direction in preserving and revitalizing Alaska Native languages and culture. In the 1970s, bilingual programs were implemented in order to comply with state law, which requires that all Alaska schools with 15 or more, now 8 or more, students whose primary language is other than English shall have a teacher fluent in that language and an instructional program and materials in the language. However, integrating traditional teaching and learning practices back into education systems has also presented challenges to educators teaching in these schools. Indigenous educators are constantly challenged by the conflict and compromise associated with developing curriculum that reflects Indigenous worldview while attending to the Western forms of knowledge that students may need for future economic survival. Alaska Native culture and way of learning is much more different from Western culture and Western way of learning, and that it is not easy to combine the two. Additionally, it is good to point out that despite the bilingual programs implemented in the 1970s, with the exception of one community, the majority of teachers in every community are normally non-Native people from outside the community, some from outside Alaska, and are not familiar with Alaska, its Native people, or its history. Members from these communities have voiced their displeasure with this situation and urged for programs that have better trained Native and non-Native teachers. This issue shows the difficulties of maintaining and reviving a language and culture while still living in a more dominant language and cultural environment that is different from one's own. To bring in an Alaskan metaphor, preserving and revitalizing Alaska Native language and culture in an environment that has a more dominant culture and language can be like salmon swimming upstream. It takes a lot of strength and persistence to go against the flow of the rest of the Western world. Another challenge in studying Alaska Native languages and cultures is that some anthropologists and linguists studying these languages and cultures are not originally from these native languages, or these native villages. This leads to language barriers between the linguists or anthropologists and the native speakers. One humorous example is a research project that aimed to find the nest of a specific species of eagle called by the natives Tegniarpak. A researcher named Kenneth Pratt in the summer of 1985 spent more than 2 months conducting fieldwork for this project in southwestern Alaska. He was searching for the eagle's nest by interviewing elders who recalled seeing the nest before. Pratt, who was not Alaska Native, needed an interpreter to interview the elders and other community members for his research. There was a miscommunication between Pratt and the interpreter, and after the 2 months was almost over, and having gotten nowhere close to finding the Tegniarpak nest, The researcher realized the nest was right under his nose. He just did not fully understand what was being communicated to him. The entire time, Pratt thought he was searching for the nest of a super eagle. But, because of miscommunications and misinterpretations, the Tangnyarpak was actually a giant landscape that was shaped like an eagle. Pratt was eventually taken out near the closing of his summer fieldwork with a local native named Philip to finally see the infamous Tangnyarpak. Pratt writes, Philip explained that the small stream cutting through the head of the valley flowed down the ditch created the Tangnyarpak's neck. The slopes of the valley and the willow-alder brush growing partially up their sides defined the bird's wings. The floor of the valley represented the hollow of land created by the weight of the Tangnyarpak's body, and the two ponds lying in the center of the valley represented the bird's eggs. Pratt spent his summer looking for a living eagle, but learned that the Tangnyarpak was not a living eagle, but was a beautiful landscape. The account of this search illustrates how the linguistic incompetence of researchers in multilingual settings can generate tremendous confusion, particularly if the success of the research they are conducting relies on the mutual comprehension of abstract concepts. This humorous example shows how a language and culture barrier can be challenging to the researcher studying the language or culture. The language and culture barrier can also prolong the process of preserving and revitalizing Alaska Native language and culture. Like many other parts of Alaska Native cultures, the many languages, such as the Upper Inlet Tanana and Ahtna languages, have been impacted by Western influence. This influence goes back to when Westerners first arrived and is still an influence today, leaving many Alaska Native languages dying or mostly dead, with minimal speakers still alive. The question now being is, should these languages die, or should efforts be made to preserve and revitalize them? This can only be answered by the Alaska Natives themselves, who are able and willing to continue speaking their languages while telling stories or teaching in the Alaska Native schools, and the process will also need the willingness and passion from linguists and anthropologists who will be brave and patient enough to overcome the misunderstandings and challenges that often come with language and culture barriers.